Our story begins in 1883, when the land that would become Waverly Hills was nothing more than a peaceful hilltop overlooking the Ohio River Valley, far from the crowded streets of Louisville, Kentucky. Major Thomas H. Hayes, the property's first owner, saw this elevated ground as the perfect location for his family home. However, the isolation that drew Hayes in would later present a practical problem. The nearest school was far too distant for his daughters to attend, and so Major Hayes constructed a small schoolhouse on the property for his daughters to attend, and he named it Waverly. The name Waverly comes from the Waverly novels by Walter Scott, which was a series that was beloved by Hayes's wife. It was a simple beginning, marked by the laughter of children and the daily rhythm of lessons. No one could have predicted how this modest little schoolhouse would transform into one of America's most significant medical institutions, and later, one of its most notorious haunted locations. As the 19th century drew its final breaths, a silent killer was stalking America's citizens. Tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that turned the simple act of breathing into a death sentence, and it was about to transform the nation's cities into a breeding ground for tragedy. In homes across the country, families watched helplessly as their loved ones withered away. The disease earned its terrible nickname consumption because it seemed to be devouring its victims from within. First came the chronic coughs, then the blood-flecked handkerchiefs, and finally the hollow-eyed gauntness that marked the disease's fatal progression. And in an age before antibiotics, a tuberculosis diagnosis was oftentimes akin to a death sentence. Louisville, Kentucky stood at the epicenter of this growing nightmare. The city's geography betrayed its people. It was nestled in the Ohio River Valley, where stagnant air trapped the smoke from countless factories' chimneys, creating a poisonous soup that settled in the human lungs. The damp, polluted atmosphere turned Louisville into the perfect incubator for the bacterium. By 1910, the numbers had become impossible to ignore. Louisville's tuberculosis death rate had climbed to nearly 250 deaths per 100,000 residents, one of the highest in the nation. Entire families were being decimated, and children were being orphaned. Something had to be done. In response to the crisis, the city established a tuberculosis hospital board. But they would soon discover that fighting the disease required more than just good intentions. It would require a fortress against the disease, one that would rise on a hillside and become both a beacon of hope and a house of horrors. As Louisville's medical board searched desperately for a solution, salvation appeared in an unlikely form: a modest schoolhouse perched atop Major Thomas H. Hayes' property. The location seemed to be heaven sent, standing proud above the chaos taking place in the industrial valley below. The hilltop caught every breeze, and its elevation promised the clean, fresh air that doctors of that era prescribed as nature's own medicine. Waverly School was about to be transformed into something far more ambitious. In these early days of tuberculosis treatment, doctors believed that rest, good nutrition, and fresh air were the keys to recovery, and this humble hilltop offered all three in abundance. In 1910, Waverly Hills Tuberculosis Hospital opened its doors. The original structure was modest by today's standards, a 2-story wooden building that could shelter about 40 to 50 patients. Its wide windows and generous porches were designed to maximize exposure to that precious fresh air, while its elevated position kept patients far above the toxic mix of coal smoke and factory fumes that plagued the valley below. Here, among the rustling trees and singing birds, the air carried hope instead of disease. Patients could fill their damaged lungs with the clean, crisp breeze that swept across the hilltop. For many who made their journey up that hill, it felt like their first real breath in months. But even as the first patients settled into their new sanctuary, it was becoming clear that this modest wooden structure would not be enough. Tuberculosis's relentless march through Louisville's population would soon demand something far more substantial: a medical fortress whose very architecture would declare war on tuberculosis itself. By 1924, the 2-story wooden structure that had offered so much hope was now overwhelmed. Every day, more and more desperate families arrived seeking treatment, only to be turned away. The small hospital's 50-bed capacity had become a cruel limitation in the face of Louisville's growing epidemic. Something bold had to be done. What followed was one of the most ambitious medical construction projects of its era. At a staggering cost of $1.1 million, which is nearly $18 million in today's currency, The new Waverly Hills Sanatorium would rise from the hilltop like a cathedral of healing. This wasn't just a bigger hospital. It was a self-contained city for the sick, designed to isolate and treat hundreds of patients while protecting the outside world from contagion. The architecture itself was a testament to medical innovation. The massive structure stretched across the hillside in a bat-wing shape, which was designed to maximize air circulation. Long, sun-drenched solariums lined each floor. Their walls comprised almost entirely of windows that could be opened wide. Every detail, from the wide corridors to the pitched roofs, was carefully planned to create the optimal healing environment. Inside, the sanatorium was a marvel of self-sufficiency. It housed its own post office, water treatment facility, and even a working farm where patients could engage in productive outdoor therapy. The building's radio station would broadcast music and announcements throughout the day, while its fully equipped kitchens would prepare specialized diets for hundreds. As construction dust settled and paint dried, the sounds of hammers and saws gave way to the rhythm of hospital life. The squeak of rubber-wheeled gurneys echoed through the corridors, mixing with the steady click of nurses' heels on the tile floors. The murmur of medical consultations mingled with the ever-present sound of coughing, that terrible percussion that reminded everyone why this fortress of hope had been built. But even as the first patients were wheeled into their rooms, no one could have imagined how many would never leave this architectural marvel, or how its halls would eventually echo with something far more chilling than just footsteps. Daily life at Waverly Hills followed a regimented rhythm, each hour carefully orchestrated in the endless fight against tuberculosis. Patients rose with the sun, their days structured around the prevailing medical beliefs of the era. In the solariums, they would spend hours wrapped in thick blankets against the Kentucky weather, their faces turned towards the sunlight, like human flowers seeking healing warmth. These long hours of enforced rest had their own soundtrack: the gentle creaking of wooden rocking chairs, the soft rustle of newspaper pages turning, and the muffled coughs that everyone tried to ignore. From some rooms came the crackling sounds of radio programs, precious connections to the outside world that helped patients forget, if only briefly, why they were there. Nurses moved through the halls with clockwork precision, dispensing medications, changing linen, and offering what comfort they could. They wore masks and gloves, their eyes often the only visible feature of their faces. But as the day faded into night, a darker side of Waverly Hills emerged. The desperate search for a cure led to treatments that now seem more like torture than medicine. Thoracoplasty, a procedure so brutal it would make modern surgeons recoil. It involved removing ribs one by one to collapse the infected lung, supposedly allowing it to heal. Without modern anesthesia or pain management, patients endured unimaginable agony. The screams would echo through the hospital's corridors, a chilling reminder of medicine's limitations. Other experimental treatments were equally as harrowing, like artificial pneumothorax, which is collapsing a lung by filling the chest cavity with nitrogen gas, and it left patients struggling for breath. Some underwent sun treatments, where ultraviolet lamps would burn their skin in an attempt to kill the bacteria, leaving them with severe burns that rivaled the pain of their original affliction. Yet perhaps most haunting was the knowledge that these brutal procedures represented hope, often the last hope for people who had exhausted all other options. Patients would literally give their ribs for a chance to breathe freely again. Between the screams and the surgeries, whispered prayers filled the night air. Some begged for healing, while others for a swift end to their suffering. In these halls, hopes and horror walked hand in hand, and the line between salvation and torture was as thin as a surgeon's blade. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff and the willingness of patients to endure almost unbearable treatments, death remained an ever-present resident at Waverly Hills. The hospital needed a way to handle this grim reality while maintaining hope for those still fighting for their lives. Their solution would become one of the most infamous features of Waverly Hills, a feature that perfectly encapsulated both the practical ingenuity and the psychological burden of operating a tuberculosis sanatorium. Hidden from the patient's view, but central to the hospital's operation, was the body chute, a 525-foot tunnel that stretched from the hospital's lowest level to the bottom of the hill. This engineering marvel, officially known as the Death Tunnel, or the Underground Pneumatic Tunnel, was both a triumph of practical design and a chilling reminder of the hospital's true purpose. When patients lost their battle with tuberculosis, sometimes at rates as high as 1 per hour during the worst periods, their bodies would be discreetly transported to this tunnel. Using a motorized rail and pulley system, the deceased would make one final journey down the steep incline, away from the eyes of those still clinging to hope in the rooms above. The tunnel's practical purpose was clear: to prevent surviving patients from witnessing the constant procession of death that was an inevitable part of the sanatorium's life. Every time a body disappeared into that dark passage, the staff above could maintain the facade of optimism and continued telling their patients that the next treatment might be the one to save them. In 1943, a breakthrough in laboratory science would seal the fate of tuberculosis sanatoriums across America. The discovery of streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against tuberculosis, transformed a death sentence into a treatable condition. The disease that had claimed so many lives would finally begin to lose its grip on the nation. For Waverly Hills, this medical miracle marked the beginning of a gradual decline. The massive structure that had once been a bustling city of healing slowly grew quieter. Where hundreds of patients had once filled the solariums, now empty chairs rocked in the Kentucky breeze. The sounds of treatments and suffering that had echoed through these halls for decades began to fade. In 1961, after more than 50 years of service, Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed its doors to tuberculosis patients. But the building that had witnessed so much suffering wasn't finished with its role in Louisville's medical history. Within months, its corridors would be filled with new residents as it transformed into Woodhaven Geriatric Center. The elderly who now occupied these rooms brought their own stories, their own fears, and some say their own ghosts to mingle with those already walking these halls. From 1961 to 1981, Woodhaven would write new chapters in the building's history, chapters that would only add to its reputation as one of America's most haunted locations. Between the stories that would emerge from Woodhaven's 2 decades of operation and Waverly's more than half a century in operation, it would seem that sometimes the living can create horrors that rival anything the dead might conjure. Today, as daylight fades and shadows lengthen across Waverly's worn corridors, the building's other residents start to make their presence known. Each floor holds its own mysteries, each room its own stories, and those brave enough to walk these halls after dark often find themselves face to face with unexplainable phenomena that challenge rational explanation. Room 502 stands as perhaps the most notorious location within these haunted halls. In 1928, the room witnessed tragedy as nurse Mary Hillenberg took her own life, reportedly driven to desperation by an unwanted pregnancy. 4 years later, another nurse allegedly plunged to her death from the room's window under mysterious circumstances. Today, Room 502's atmosphere is thick with almost tangible darkness. Visitors report sudden drops in temperature that leave their breath visible even on summer nights. The most common occurrence is a woman's voice, sharp and clear and filled with urgency, ordering people to get out. Some have even glimpsed a figure in a white nursing uniform standing at the window, only to vanish when approached. The rest of the 5th floor holds its own terrifying residents. Here, where the most severe tuberculosis cases were treated, shadow figures move with unsettling purpose through doorways and along corridors. Unlike typical shadow phenomena, these entities are described as being darker than the darkness surrounding them, moving with unnatural fluidity that defies physics. Visitors report the sound of shuffling feet dragging across wooden floors, the squeak of hospital gurneys that no longer exist, and the muffled coughs of those long-departed patients. Perhaps the most chilling is the entity known as the Creeper. Unlike the other spirits that seem bound to specific locations, this shadow creature crawls across walls and ceilings throughout the building. Witnesses describe it as massive, its shape constantly shifting as it moves, and leaving those who encounter it with an overwhelming sense of dread. Even experienced paranormal investigators find themselves unsettled by its presence. Not all of Waverly's spirits inspire fear, however. The ghost of young Timmy, whose presence is most often felt in the 1st floor corridors, brings a more playful energy to the building. Visitors who bring toys, particularly rubber balls, often find them rolling back to them after they've been pushed down empty hallways. And the sound of children's laughter echoes through these areas where the youngest patients were treated. and small handprints sometimes appear in the dust, only to vanish moments later. On the fourth floor, witnesses describe a particular phenomena that defies explanation: the lingering scent of freshly baked bread that wafts through the abandoned kitchen, accompanied by the ghostly figure of a former cook going about his eternal duties. In the former operating theater, the spirit of a physician still makes his rounds, his footsteps echoing with purpose down empty corridors before vanishing into thin air. And even the infamous body chute holds its own supernatural secrets. Today, the death tunnel stands as perhaps the most haunting reminder of Waverly Hills history. The tunnel's concrete walls, which once witnessed thousands of final journeys, seem to hold more than just memories. The air here runs noticeably colder than the rest of the building, and the darkness feels almost solid, as if the weight of its history is giving it physical form. Modern visitors who dare to venture into this underground passage report terrifying paranormal experiences, like mysterious lights that drift through the absolute darkness, the echoes of footsteps when no one else is present, and the constant, unshakable sensation of being watched. Perhaps it's simply the power of suggestion, the natural human response to knowing what happened here. Or perhaps, as many believe, this tunnel serves as a kind of gateway, not just between the hospital and the valley below, but between our world and whatever lies beyond. In 2001, when Charlie and Tina Mattingly first stood before the looming structure of Waverly Hills, they saw beyond the broken windows and crumbling walls. They recognized something that demanded preservation, not just a building, but a chronicle of American medical history, written in brick and mortar. Under their careful stewardship, this massive monument to both suffering and hope has found a new purpose as both a historical landmark and a paranormal destination. Walking through Waverly Hills today is like stepping into a place where time itself has become fluid. Sunlight streams through the shattered windows, creating shifting patterns across the original tile work that still clings to the walls. And the wind moves through the building much as it did in the 1920s, still whistling down the corridors where thousands once walked. In empty rooms, abandoned medical equipment from different eras lies scattered like archaeological artifacts. A wheelchair here, an examination table there, and each piece a silent witness to the human drama that unfolded within these walls. The massive solariums, once filled with patients seeking healing in the fresh air and sunshine, now stand empty, but somehow not vacant. There's a weight to the stillness here, as if the building itself remembers. But Waverly Hills is more than just another alleged haunted location. It stands as a complex monument to human experience, a physical reminder of how we faced one of history's deadliest diseases. These halls echo with the stories of medical advancement, social change, and human resilience. Each room holds memories of desperate courage: the patients who submitted to brutal treatments in hope of a cure, the medical staff who fought daily battles against death, and the researchers who sought the answers in the midst of an epidemic. Whether drawn here by historical interest or paranormal curiosity, visitors find themselves confronting the same profound truths that have always lived within these walls. They learn that buildings can be more than just structures. They can be repositories of human experience, holding within their walls the full spectrum of emotion: hope and fear, suffering and healing, and life and death. As the sun sets behind Louisville's skyline, casting long shadows through Waverly's countless windows, the building seems to exhale with the weight of its memories. In the end, Waverly Hills stands as both a warning and a tribute. Its continued preservation ensures that we'll never forget the lessons written within its walls, lessons about human courage, medical progress, and the thin line between innovation and desperation.